When this officer faced certain death, his K-9 police dog's heroic act left everyone in shock. Deep in the heart of a ruthless jungle, Officer Connor Campbell was bleeding, hunted, and outnumbered. Just when all hope seemed lost, his K-9 police dog, Hogo, made a fearless move that no one saw coming. One that would change everything. The jungle was alive with a lot of noise. Connor Campbell walked slowly. He held a camera and wiped sweat from his face. He looked like a wildlife photographer. But that was just a lie. Connor was a police officer. He was on a secret mission. For 3 weeks, he had taken pictures of birds and trees to look normal. But his real job was to find a group of bad men. These men were keeping people locked up, women and children. They were selling them. Connor had waited a long time. He had searched every day. Today, he finally found something. He lifted his binoculars. Far away, he saw men with guns. They stood near wooden huts. Barbed wire was around the place. Inside, people sat on the ground. Their faces were sad. Connor took a deep breath. This was the place. He reached for his radio. "Base, this is Shadow. I found the camp. Sending location now." Then he heard a noise behind him. Connor's heart stopped. Slowly, he turned his head. A guard stood there, 10 feet away. The man looked at Connor. His hands moved to his gun. Connor had to act fast. The guard opened his mouth to shout. Connor jumped forward. He punched the guard in the face. The man stepped back, holding his jaw, but he was still standing. He grabbed his gun. Connor was faster. He grabbed the gun and hit the guard on the head. The man fell to the ground. Connor turned off the guard's radio. But it was too late. People in the camp had seen him. Shouts filled the air. More men ran toward him. They had guns. Connor ran. Bullets flew past him. They hit trees and bushes. He kept running. Then he saw a river. If he reached the water, he could escape. Connor ran faster. When he reached the river, he jumped. Cold water hit his body. The strong current pulled him away. Above him, men shouted. They want to catch him. Connor swam hard. He had to get away. The mission was not over yet. The river pulled Connor fast. The water was strong. He tried to keep his head up. He needed air. Behind him, men shouted. Gunshots cracked. The traffickers were looking for him. Connor kicked harder. The cold water made his body shake, but he kept moving. He had to get far away. After some time, the river slowed down. He saw a fallen tree in the water. He grabbed it and pulled himself to the shore. He lay on the ground, breathing hard. Then he heard voices. The traffickers were coming. Connor got up. His side hurt. He looked down. His shirt was wet with blood. A bullet had hit him, but it was not deep. He had no time to stop the bleeding. He had to run. The jungle was thick and dark. Trees stood tall. The ground was full of bushes and vines. It was hard to move fast. Connor heard footsteps. The traffickers were close. He pushed forward. His body hurt, but he could not stop. He had to escape. Then he heard a bark. His heart jumped. "Hogo," he whispered. A black dog ran toward him. It was Hogo, his police dog. Connor knelt down. "Good boy," he said softly. Hogo licked his hand, then turned his head. His ears were up. He was listening. Connor touched his back. "Help me, buddy. We need to go." Hogo sniffed the air. Then he ran. Connor followed him. Hogo knew the jungle better. He moved fast, avoiding noisy places. Connor trusted him. Then they heard a whistle. Connor's stomach tightened. The traffickers were calling each other. They were splitting up to look for him. Hogo stopped. He growled softly. Connor froze. Then he heard it. A footstep. Someone was close. Connor picked up a thick branch from the ground. He held it tight. He did not breathe. A man stepped through the trees. He had a gun in one hand and a machete in the other. He looked at the ground, following footprints. He was a hunter. He knew the jungle well. The man bent down. He touched the earth where Connor had walked. Then he looked up. His eyes met Connor's. For 1 second, they both stayed still. Then Connor moved. He threw the branch at the man's face. The man lifted his gun, but Hogo was faster. Hogo jumped, biting the man's arm. The gun fired, bang, but the bullet missed. Connor grabbed the machete from the man's hand. He hit the man's head with the handle. The man fell. He did not move. Connor looked at Hogo. The dog was ready. Connor's breathing was fast. His side hurt more. The gunshot was loud. Others would hear it. They had to move. Connor patted Hogo. "Let's go." Hogo ran ahead. Connor followed. His body was weak. His legs felt heavy. His side hurt where the bullet had cut him. His shirt was wet with blood. His breathing was fast. His head felt light. Hogo ran beside him. His ears were up. His nose sniffed the air. He was looking for a safe place. Connor touched Hogo's back. "Find water, boy," he whispered. Hogo sniffed again. Then he ran ahead. Connor followed. He stepped over roots. He pushed past branches. Sweat dripped down his face. Then he heard it. Water. A stream. Hogo stopped at the edge of the water. Connor fell to his knees. He scooped water with his hands and drank. It was cold. It felt good. Hogo drank too. Connor splashed water on his face. He felt a little better, but he was not safe. A loud crack echoed through the trees. A gunshot. Connor's heart jumped. The traffickers were close. He needed a plan. He looked around. The jungle was thick. There were vines and fallen branches. He could use them. Connor grabbed a sharp stick. He pulled vines from a tree. He tied them together. His hands moved fast. He dug a hole. He covered it with leaves. If someone stepped there, they would fall in. Then he climbed a tree. He tied a vine to a heavy log. If someone walked by and tripped the vine, the log would swing down and hit them. He wiped sweat from his face. It was not much, but it would slow them down. Hogo looked at him. He was waiting. Connor knelt beside him. "We need to go, buddy." Hogo wagged his tail once. Then he ran ahead. A strong smell filled the air. Smoke. Connor stopped. His eyes widened. The traffickers were burning the jungle. Black smoke rose into the sky. Fire spread fast. The heat hit Connor's face. They wanted to force him out. Connor coughed. The air was thick. His eyes burned. Hogo barked and ran in another direction. Connor followed. His legs felt weak, but he kept going. The fire was spreading too fast. If they stayed, they would burn. Smoke covered everything. Trees cracked and fell. Flames roared. Connor could barely see. "Hogo," he called. The dog barked. Connor followed the sound. His chest hurt. His legs shook. Then, fresh air. They made it out. Connor dropped to the ground, coughing. His eyes stung. His body ached. But he was alive. Hogo licked his face. Connor patted his head. "Good boy." But they were not safe yet. The traffickers were still coming. Connor crouched low behind a rock. His body hurt, and his breathing was heavy. The wound on his side burned, and he felt weak. Hogo stood beside him. His ears were up, and his eyes watched the trees. He knew danger was close. Then, Connor heard movement. Leaves rustled. Footsteps crushed the dirt. The traffickers had found him. A voice called out, "Come out, officer." Connor stayed silent. "You have nowhere to go," the man said again. His voice was cold. Connor looked around. Behind him was a deep gorge. Below, a wild river rushed over sharp rocks. If he jumped, he would not survive. He was trapped. The traffickers moved closer. He counted 5 men, maybe more. Some were hiding in the trees. Connor gripped a thick branch in his hand. He had set traps, but not enough. Now he had to fight. The first man ran toward him. Connor swung the branch hard. It hit the man's face, and he fell back with a grunt. Another man charged with a knife. Connor stepped aside, just as the blade slashed the air. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it. The knife dropped to the ground. Before the man could react, Hogo jumped. His sharp teeth bit into the man's leg. The trafficker screamed and fell. Connor turned, but another attacker grabbed him from behind. A hard punch hit his ribs. Pain shot through Connor's body. He gasped, but he pushed back, slamming the man into a tree. Another man came at him fast. Connor grabbed the fallen knife and slashed the air. The man stopped, his eyes wide. For a moment, everything was still. Then, bang! A bullet hit a tree near Connor's head. The traffickers had guns now. Connor ducked behind a rock again. Hogo stayed low beside him, growling. More footsteps. More voices. There were too many of them. Connor's hands tightened into fists. He would not give up. Then, through the trees, he saw something. A small, blinking light. His team. They were near. They were coming for him. Hope rushed through Connor. But he had to survive a little longer. The traffickers moved closer. Connor stood up. His body hurt, but his mind was strong. He would fight until help arrived. Hogo barked and leaped at a man, biting his arm. The man shouted, and his gun fell to the ground. Connor punched another man in the chest. The trafficker stumbled backward and fell. A third man grabbed Connor's shirt, but Connor spun and kicked him away. Another gun fired. Connor ducked just in time. He couldn't keep fighting much longer. His strength was fading. Then, loud voices. Strong, commanding voices. His team. Gunshots rang through the jungle. The traffickers turned in shock. Connor dropped to his knees, breathing hard. Hogo stood beside him, panting. The fight was over. His team had arrived. Connor reached out and touched Hogo's head. "We did it, buddy." Hogo wagged his tail, his eyes still alert. The jungle was quiet again. Gunshots filled the jungle, loud and sharp. Connor stayed low behind a rock. His heart pounded. His body hurt. His side burned from the wound. He felt weak, but he could not stop now. The fight was not over. Hogo crouched beside him. His ears twitched. His sharp eyes watched the trees. He was ready. Connor looked ahead. His team had arrived. The police were fighting the traffickers. Officers hid behind trees and logs, shooting back. The traffickers fired wildly. Some tried to run. Others stayed to fight. Then Connor saw something that made his stomach tighten. Two traffickers were running toward the back of the camp. Connor knew where they were going. The prisoners. If the traffickers reached them first, they could hurt them. Connor could not let that happen. He pushed off the rock and ran. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move faster. One of the traffickers saw him. He reached for his gun. Connor did not slow down. He slammed into the man's body, knocking him to the ground. The gun fell. The trafficker tried to fight back. Connor grabbed his wrist and twisted. The man groaned in pain. Then Connor punched him. Hard. The man went still. Before Connor could take a breath, the second trafficker pointed a rifle at him. Then Hogo leaped. The dog hit the man's chest, knocking him down. His sharp teeth bit the man's arm. The trafficker screamed. Connor grabbed the rifle and pointed it at the man. "Where are the prisoners?" he asked. The man groaned. His face was full of fear. Connor stepped closer. "Tell me now." The trafficker looked at the small wooden hut. Inside, he whispered. Connor let go and rushed toward the door. He kicked it open. The room was dark. It smelled bad. Inside, people sat on the floor. Their hands were tied. Their faces were pale. Some were women. Some were children. A little girl hugged her mother. She was shaking. Connor's chest tightened. He felt angry. These people had suffered. He took a deep breath and knelt down. "You're safe now," he said softly. The mother looked up at him. Tears filled her eyes. "Are you with the police?" she asked. Connor nodded. "Yes. No one will hurt you now." He pulled out his knife and cut the ropes. The prisoners rubbed their wrists. Their eyes were full of hope. The little girl reached out and touched Hogo's fur. Hogo wagged his tail. Connor smiled. "He's a good boy." For the first time, the girl smiled back. Then, gunfire outside. Connor's heart jumped. He turned to the prisoners. "Follow me. Stay low." Connor led them outside. The battle was still going on. The police were winning. Some traffickers had dropped their weapons and put their hands up. Others were still fighting. A police officer saw them and waved. "Get them to safety." Connor turned to the prisoners. "Go with him. You'll be okay." The mother grabbed his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Connor gave her a small nod. "Go now." She and the others ran to the officer. Connor turned back. He was not done. Only two traffickers were left. They were hiding behind a wooden crate, reloading their guns. Connor saw his chance. He ran toward them. One of the men saw him too late. Connor tackled him to the ground. He punched the man in the chest. The man groaned and lay still. The last trafficker aimed his gun. Hogo attacked. The dog knocked the man over. The gun fired, but the bullet hit the dirt. Connor grabbed the gun and swung it hard, hitting the man in the face. The trafficker fell, not moving. Silence. Connor stood still, breathing hard. The fight was over. The police searched the camp. Connor walked into one of the huts. He saw a desk covered in papers. He picked up a document. It had a list of names. Victims. Some had numbers next to them. Some names were crossed out. Connor felt sick. He grabbed more papers. Maps. Prisoner logs. Details of shipments. This was the proof they needed. He carried everything outside. A police officer took the files. His face was serious. "This will shut them down for good." Connor nodded. His body ached. His wound throbbed. But he did not care. It was over. Hogo sat beside him, panting. Connor ran a hand over the dog's back. "We did it, buddy." Hogo wagged his tail. The sun was rising. The jungle was quiet again. But this time it was safe. Connor stood still, breathing hard. His body ached, and his side burned with pain. Blood covered his shirt, but he was still standing. The battle was over. The traffickers lay on the ground, hands tied behind their backs. Police officers moved through the camp, making arrests. Some criminals tried to resist, but they were too weak, too outnumbered. The jungle was quiet now. No more gunshots, no more shouting. Only the sounds of the wind through the trees and the distant cries of rescued captives. Connor wiped sweat from his forehead. His head was spinning, but he stayed focused. He had to make sure everything was finished. Then he looked down. Hogo sat beside him, his black fur covered in dirt. His tongue hung out, his eyes sharp and alert. He was tired, but he was ready if needed. Connor knelt beside him and stroked his head. "You did good, buddy." Hogo wagged his tail, his body relaxing for the first time. A police officer walked up. "We got them all," he said, "and the captives are safe." Connor nodded. His shoulders loosened. He had been holding his breath for too long. It was finally over. The captives stood near the police trucks, wrapped in blankets. Some were crying. Others were too tired to speak. The little girl who had been afraid before now held her mother's hand. She looked at Connor, then at Hogo. Slowly, she let go of her mother and walked toward them. Connor smiled softly. "Hey there." The girl bent down and hugged Hogo. The dog stayed still, then licked her cheek. She giggled. Connor felt warmth in his chest. After everything she had been through, she could still smile. The mother walked up and placed a hand on Connor's arm. "You saved us," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank you." Connor shook his head. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Tears filled the woman's eyes, but she smiled. "Bless you." Connor watched as they walked toward the trucks, ready to go home.